Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. This is where truth and facts are uncovered. Last week at the South African Athletics Championships, World Athletics Champion Caster Semenya and others were banned from participating in any athletics category until they reduced their testosterone levels. This is because they belong to a category of people considered to have differences of sexual development, or DSD in short. But how credible are the scientific studies these regulations rely on? Is this form of discrimination necessary to preserve the integrity of female athletics? Or is this plain racism and sexism? Let's welcome our guests this evening. We're joined by Dr. Cindy Bana, who is the Principal Specialist and Head of the Endocrinology and Metabolism at Baragwanath Hospital. We're also welcoming Thuli Zungu, who is a feminist human rights lawyer. Neto Chimane is a sports broadcaster. And joining us on Zoom from Namibia is Henk Botha for a teenage DSD athlete, Christine Mboma. Remember to join in our discussion on Twitter using the handle @Unfiltered SABC. Before we dive into our conversation, let's watch this insert, produced by Jacqueline Mapala.
I had to fight for, other kids also that are in the same condition, because the condition that we in, we cannot control it. It's genetical. You're born with it. There's nothing you can do about it. And all these young girls, they're talented. They want to pursue their careers, and there's no one who's fighting for them. Our leaders are cowards. They're sitting down there, they go there, they're having coffee with these guys. Then they come to you, they pretend as if they're doing something. And it's one of the things that, for me personally, I wanted to expose.
A frank and open conversation about her struggles last year, talking about the storm that her life has been since 2009 as a World Athletics Champion. For the past 14 years, Caster Semenya has become the poster child for many athletes around the world, classified as a DSD, or athletes with differences in sexual development, characterized by a higher than usual levels of testosterone, a hormone that increases muscle mass and strength and the body's ability to use oxygen. Once again, she's had to pull out of the recent South African Championships, following new regulations preventing DSD athletes from competing in all categories unless they lower their testosterone levels, either through medication or surgery. This is something she was forced to do in the past when the restrictions only affected the 400 meters and 1.5 kilometer distance, with negative consequences on her health.
Semenya has a personal best in this event, 9:49.85.
The raging argument within this conversation about these rules and the justification for gender verification is whether the World Athletics has a right to decide what normal women should look like, violate human rights, or even rely on a scientific study whose credibility remains in question. The Association of South African Athletics sees these regulations as highly discriminatory, but says while it cannot violate the rules of its mother body, it has, however, referred the matter for legal opinion. Curiously, the rules only apply to transgender athletes, and no such gender surveillance is imposed on male athletes, despite evidence that some of them have the added advantage due to their biological makeup. Among others is Finnish skier Iro Manturanta, who's dubbed the greatest endurance athlete because his red blood cells were 20% higher than those of other athletes, and Michael Phelps, who produces less lactic acid compared to his competitors, which shortens his recovery time. Observers add that this scrutiny is racialized, an assault on black bodies, with African and Asian women being mostly affected and some having a premature end to their careers. The 60-year history of sex testing is littered with shameful human rights abuses, which has caused immense harm to the victims. Initially, female athletes were humiliated when they had to parade naked in front of a panel of doctors to verify their sex before the games. In 1985, the International Olympic Committee disqualified a Spanish hurdler, Maria José Martínez Patino, for failing a gender test. Its various mutations also includes using chromosomal test, checking testes development to test what was called sexually ambiguous athletes, where some women were classified as men, including in the 1996 Atlanta Olympics. To date, suspicion-based testing continues, which is the profiling and targeting of women according to gender stereotypes.
I become a world champion, and then my gender is questioned. It was not a problem. The problem was how IAAF dealt with the situation. And for me, it was just nothing, because at the end of the day, I knew who I was, I understood myself. For me, it wasn't, a problem in the equation. Yes, I know my appearance. I know, I'm masculine, I have a deep voice. I dress more like guys, so that wasn't a problem. The problem was how they disrespected me in public, the humiliation.
After losing many appeals against the rules, the hope of Caster Semenya and other affected athletes rest in the European Court of Human Rights. But for some, the outcome may be too late, as it would mean an end to their means of survival. Ultimately, the key question that the World Athletics is yet to answer is whether discrimination is justified in the context where no scientific consensus exists that women with naturally higher testosterone have a performance advantage in all sports.
Let's explore some of these questions now with our panel, and we are going to be speaking to various members of our panel. Dr. Botha, Mr. Botha, who is a coach. We're going to be speaking to Dr. Bana, who is a medical expert, Ms. Zulu from the human rights perspective, and we're also going to be speaking to Mr. Chemana, who comes from a sports broadcasting perspective. And that's really the panel that we're going to put together to chew over these issues. So when we come back, we'll be dissecting these issues with this panel from multiple perspectives. See you in a moment. Welcome back to Unfiltered with me, Mboma Walsh. We're discussing a thorny question about the politicization of female athletics and the extent to which we should be defining who and who cannot compete in female athletics in the world today. We're going to speak to Mr. Botha now, who is the coach of Christine Mboma, an 18-year-old Namibian athlete who has been hit by these new regulations, which effectively impede her capacity to continue to participate in the sport she loves. Could you, Mr. Botha, just tell us how you broke the news to Christine, if you did, and how she responded to hearing the impact of these regulations on her career? What was her sense and what were the emotions that she went through upon hearing that her career could be threatened by these regulations?
Yeah, I might just add that thank you for having me here. The biggest issue for me is the fact that the way it's been announced and the way it's been handled, even the first time when the girls was not allowed to do the 400, it's just been dumped in the press. And I wasn't with Christine. And somebody from the press phoned me late at the night, and I just asked Christine to put down the phone and don't read any social media. And I had to travel 500 kilometers to get to her and just explain to her the situation that's going on. And obviously, both of us planning to go to the World Championships were shocked. And for me, the biggest concern is protecting people and just being a humanitarian when you do these things. And World Athletic once again just failed us. The previous time when we heard that Christine is not allowed to run the 400, we actually were promised that it's going to be handled in such a matter that it's not going to be exposing the athlete that anyhow. And we were at the airport and just got the news on social media.
Tell us about that conversation where you drove, you said, don't read anything, don't look at anything, and just take us into what that conversation was like for you and for her.
Yeah, obviously, for me, the first thing is this is a young girl that was born in a village, and she was born as a girl, and she doesn't know anything else. Suddenly, the world is telling her that there's something wrong with her, and that she's not a woman. I mean, if you take Mr. Coe's words where he said it's fairness to women. Now, does he mean Christine is not a woman? What is the whole point that he's trying to get over there, first of all? And secondly, we need to give her a support structure, because she's really at a low now, and she's very, very vulnerable at this stage, because, as 18, 19-year-old, how do you explain to somebody that you are not a woman?
And what is the impact on her if she's not able to compete? Take us through what that could mean for her life.
Yeah, you must understand that she had plans and we had plans, and the whole thing is this was a life-changing experience for her family and the people around her, and suddenly they just cut off the vein that was supposed to help this kid to change her own life. Obviously, we are also busy with some research, and we are trying to get some information, but we are not going to let World Athletics stop us as far as this matter is concerned. But obviously, this is a big thing, and this is a career-ending thing that's going on.
Ms. Zulu, what are the kinds of human rights questions that are brought to bear on this situation? Can you take us through some of the legal and rights questions, which are very thorny here on gender, on race, on questions of discrimination and equality?
I think the first point to acknowledge with regards to human rights is that human rights are rights that are afforded to people on the basis of them being human. And so in the question of excluding transgender women from participating in sports, it speaks to a variety of human rights. Obviously, being discrimination, there is a glaring case of discrimination in this case because transgendered women are women and therefore they are deserving of human rights. But also in this question, there is a variety of other rights that are affected, being the right to self-determination. Transgender women have a right to say that they are women, and also they do have a right to employment. In this case, these women use sports to make a living, and so... And
of course, there is the distinction between DSD and transgender.
Yes,
and
yes.
I think that's quite important to make that distinction as we continue the conversation.
Yes, there is a difference, and with regards to human rights, it's important to note that in cases where there's discrimination, it's important to note when discrimination is fair or unfair. And in this instance, it would appear that the discrimination is unfair because it excludes a specific group of people, wherein international law and domestic and regional law all states that people cannot be discriminated on the basis of their gender, their sexuality, religion, and otherwise. And so excluding transgendered women and other variety of gender identifying people from participating in the sports means that there's been a case of unfair discrimination just on those bases of them identifying as a certain kind of gender. That is not per se normal in society, or that is not the norm as in the previous times.
Do you think that we should make a rights distinction between DSD women and transgender women, to the extent that there may be biological differences between the two?
I think in a human rights perspective, it would be unfair because we live in a society where we are discovering more and more genders, groups of people, sexualities, and I would believe that if someone has identified themselves as a woman, we should respect the choice. As in their human rights, they have a right to say, I am a woman and I'm going to participate in sports that women participate in.
And we're going to come to the wider debate that opens up with various members of the panel. But Mr. Chimane, I also wanted to just, for the record, explain some of these regulations, because exactly what the regulations are is not always clear. And can you help us to just understand what these regulations are and what's new about what's been said recently?
Thank you, Cesar. A very good evening to you and a very good evening to all the Unfiltered viewers and my panelists. Look, these regulations, what they imply is that, for an example, if you run in a distance of 400 meters to a mile, you are affected, like Mr. Botha was explaining. Now, this is a scenario where if you change a discipline, now then it's all over the show, because then there's conditions apply. You take this discipline, or if you want to run in this discipline, then you've got to go through medical suppression of your natural abilities. And that's what then makes it unfair, because you've got a caster who won in the 2016 Rio Olympics, gold medalist, and was unable to defend her title because of the very same regulations that brought us here. And this is an ongoing issue. And by the way, it does not even start here, but it starts way back. I mean, around 2009 already, Caster was dragged into this issue around superior testosterone and all of that. And now it's more than a decade, and we are still here. And this is the same Caster who is now affected to perform, and not only her, but various other athletes around the African continent, Christine Mboma, Beatrice Masilingi, also from Namibia, Margaret Wambui from Kenya. The list is endless. And these are athletes that are coming with their natural abilities, but because of these regulations, unfortunately then, they find themselves wanting. And remember, a career path, it's a very short career.
And is your view that this is an attempt to target specifically African competitors? Is this the equivalent of what the ICC does in terms of criminal prosecution in sport, that it just so happens that there happen to be a disproportionate number of African competitors? Or is there some overt or covert discrimination at play in your view?
Look, in my view, it looks like it's targeting African excellence, because how else can you explain it? That when you've got a group of African athletes that are doing tremendously well, then suddenly there's a whole lot of obstructions, disruptions, that are speaking to their excellence. And remember that when you've done well, let's say in the 2016 Olympics, it goes into the history books. And then 4 years later, you were unable to defend your title. Now people will start wanting to know what happened here. And if you trace it and you zoom into the entire situation, it is suggesting that African excellence is being targeted.
Absolutely, and we'll pursue these questions further. But before we do so, Dr. Bana, just to bring your expertise in, and thank you very much for bringing a scientific and a medical perspective in here. Can you maybe take us through, even if briefly, how the medical questions actually are brought to bear here? Because it's one thing to have a political conversation, but that also does need to be grounded in scientific rigor. What are the kinds of scientific questions we should be bearing in mind as we uncover this conversation?
So, if you want to bring science into sport, then I believe you've got to bring it at every level. You cannot pick and choose. So in this case, we're looking at testosterone levels. And so if you just look amongst males, just all the males sitting in the studio, if you were to plot them, their reference ranges would be between 12 and 27. That's the normal reference range. So I could be sitting at 13, and you as an athlete could be sitting at 26, and we're both competing in the same race. And so therein lies an issue as well. If the association wants female athletes who have high testosterone levels to drop their testosterone levels, and they said they'll have an acceptable level of 5, well, you cannot adjust the medication to have it exactly at 5. So if I ask you to take a medication and I force you to take medication and it goes down to 1, and there's other females sitting at 4 or 5, you now creating the very disadvantage that you were speaking of earlier. So whether you bring in testosterone, whether you bring in arm length in swimming, wingspan in swimming, your height in tennis, that's when we're going to start distinguishing at many levels. I remember when I was young, I came from a school where the tradition was to run from Durban to Johannesburg. Bruce Fordyce had his career there as well. And I remember the year I captained it. The following year when I got into university, in the physiology department, we worked out what my VO2 max was. And we realized at that time that there was no way I was going to be able to compete against the likes of Mark Pleikes, because his VO2 max was about 68 and mine was 58. And you can't influence that. So does that mean the two of us have to run in a different race? Well, if that is the case, then the athletic associations and the bodies need to define all the categories. And that's going to be impossible. So it's not about what is right, is wrong. Define the rules and then apply it equally to every sport, every person, every gender, every age group as well.
No, absolutely. And I think we've laid out a background for a debate and a conversation to ensue. We'll do that after the break. We'll look at whether this is a form of discrimination or whether this is appropriate for preserving the integrity of athletics. See you after the break. Welcome back. You're still watching Unfiltered on SABC News. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. After the World Athletics Organization has passed a set of rules that have thrown athletes into disarray in terms of whether they should be defined as competing as female athletes or not. And Dr. Bana, we have been just speaking a little bit about the science now. Could you just dive deeper for us into the question of, is it hyperandrogenization or hyperandrogyny, and what that means and how hyperandrogyny might be different to transgender?
So the two are completely different. So when we're talking about androgens, we're looking at a group of hormones, and it can be DHEA, it can be testosterone, it can be androstenedione down, it can be dihydrotestosterone. So there are 4 what we call male hormones, but we must understand that they exist both in males and in females, just at a different level.
Right.
So there's a few conditions that can lead somebody to have hyperandrogens. It can be something called polycystic ovarian syndrome. Now that affects 30% of females between the ages of 18 and 35. That's a lot of people. And they would tend to have slightly higher androgens than the rest of the females. Then there's certain conditions that you're born with. Adult onset congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Big names, but the androgens are higher, and these people would traditionally have a bit more acne, a bit more facial hair growth, hairline receding. And then you can have some of the conditions that we're dealing with today, the DSDs. And so that's when you're sitting with testosterone production either from the adrenal gland or from the testes. And then what happens, because of a genetic issue, the testosterone cannot express itself in utero when all these organs are developing, and then you get variation in terms of the genitals. And as a society, historically, we defined people as being boy or girl based on what we see at birth. Now that's changing. And so from that perspective, that's what we're looking at when we're talking about androgens. There are some cancers that can cause androgens as well.
Can I ask you on hyperandrogyny specifically?
Yeah.
I mean, the science, it doesn't seem to me, isn't actually clear that even a testosterone advantage necessarily translates into an athletic advantage. Can you take us through that? Because there's this automatic assumption that, well, if you have higher testosterone, then you suddenly have an advantage, and we can't have these advantages. Is it actually an advantage or not?
So there are many things that will make an athlete, and testosterone will be one of them. So if I happen to take a lot of testosterone, it doesn't mean I'm unable to do a 100-meter sprint better than an athlete who's born with better red fibers or is trained to do so. Do I, as an endocrinologist, believe testosterone has an advantage? Yes. Is it a huge advantage? That's never been proven. You see, that's the point. If we're looking to science as opposed to an opinion of an endocrinologist, and you're going to apply rules to a game that's going to affect somebody's income, ability to reach their goals in life, then you better have proper science behind it. And that's the thing, is that I think the scientific community hasn't interrogated this issue fully, and what kind of advantages do we have? And is it significant? Because there's advantages at every level, from a height perspective, from visual, your eyes may be better than mine, and we
can
shoot
assure
it.
you they're probably not. But
Yeah. And so coming back to the earlier issue in terms of hyperandrogenism and transgender, remember, transgender is a choice where a person feels that they were born into a boy body and they actually feel a bit more akin to being a girl, or somebody born into a girl body who feels a bit more keen to being male. And so from that perspective, there's a choice, and here there's either genetic advantage or disadvantage depending on how you want to look at it. Because here, Costa and this young lass has a genetic advantage, and now we're taking it away. So it's actually disadvantage.
And this is the debate that I think we need to get into. This is the heart of the debate. Is some say, well, the DSD question, as you've just explained now, is one thing. And often even World Athletics will define these athletes as female athletes. But a political choice as to your gender identity is a different question. And so can those who are born male, who identify as women, fairly compete, and I put this out, fairly compete in the same way that a DSD athlete who is not necessarily simply politically identifying as a woman can? And so I think the question is, do we put these athletes in the same basket? There are some who say, well, the question over DSD is fairly straightforward. It's unfair. It's discrimination. But are we going to allow people who are born male to simply compete in female athletics? And I think that's really the debate. Can I bring you in, Ms. Zulu, on that, because we started on that, and then also just get your respective views. Should we be differentiating here between transgender and DSD? Yeah.
For me, the first thing that always pops in my mind in this question is, are men always better in sports than women? And if that is a straight yes, if we were to put any man against a woman, that man would do better, then maybe we might have to question whether these two genders can compete in the same competition. However, if the question is not always or maybe, then I think transgendered women can be given an opportunity to perform against cisgendered women. But also another question that I always ponder upon is that society has put binaries in every question, and now we sit in the question of sport. It has identified who's a woman and who's a man, and what is a man capable of and what is a woman capable of. And because of that, there's this social grouping of men must do men things with other men and women must do that. And now the case of transgender brings about this confusion of, oh, what do we do now with a person who looks like a man but who doesn't identify as a man, rather as a woman? We now have this conundrum that creates these cases of discrimination, because where do we categorize these sort of persons? Obviously, they do not identify as men, but society also say they are not women. Where do we put them?
Mr. Botha, how do you feel about this question of transgender on the one hand and DSD on the other? Do you think we should be making a distinction here?
Yeah, I would like to say that I believe there's a distinction, but I also want to say that I don't say that it's unfair for transgender to take part in women's athletics. But I think, to be honest, for me, it feels like World Athletics is hiding behind transgender to get rid of the DSD athletes, and that is for me the biggest concern. But I believe that there's a difference of being born such a way and then have a choice about it. I don't say that the one or the other must not compete, but I just believe it's not fair to compare them in the same bracket.
Mr. Chimane, what's your view on this?
I actually share the same sentiments with Mr. Botha to say we've got the DSD issue, which has been an ongoing journey. I mean, it even went to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, the Federal Supreme Court in Switzerland. And you must remember that once you have sport issues in court, it means the main stakeholders of the game are going to suffer. And in this case, we're talking about athletes themselves. Now, you've got that issue that is still hanging, and then now you've got the transgender issue brought into play. It's almost like, let's confuse the enemy here to push our agenda, you know, because the main agenda here is the DSD. We can have a separate conversation on the transgender, and the World Athletics can decide whether they want to create a category for them or how they want to go about it. They are the mother body of athletics. But the issue is unfairness that prevails within the DSD, the so-called DSD athletes, according to their categories.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we can look into this question of whether transgender is actually being used as a shroud for this actual question of DSD. But just because I haven't got your view on the debate as well, do you think it's a worthwhile distinction in terms of the competitiveness of the sport?
I think I concur. It's definitely two different issues. But you know, all of us spoke here and we said, are we to differentiate this? Are we? Who's the we? You see, so I think at the end of the day, the guys that are ruling that particular sport needs to lay out the rules, make it clear, unambiguous, and then athletes can come in and say, I will play with this set of rules. Because, you know, once an athlete comes in, wins a medal, and then you want to take it away because you're saying, ooh, things may be a bit different, and let's try and test this, and let's try and test that. And you see, that's the thing. And so, are we going to differentiate? I'm just saying, what they need to consider is if you're going to start distinguishing between testosterone levels, then you should be distinguishing between transgender man, transgender woman, athlete in this particular race who's 22 as opposed to 38. Distinct advantage in terms of age. And so you have got to start bringing in all these different things, and where is it going to stop? So I don't have an answer. But on this matter, the two are completely different, and I'm just wondering who this we is that's going to decide on the rules of the game.
But isn't that what World Athletics have done, actually? They've said, look, we're making a rule now, and DSD and transgender women are just simply not allowed to compete. And then suddenly when you make that rule, now you have all these questions, you try to draw a line in the sand, but then suddenly you realize that your rule is actually discriminatory. Your rule is placing athletes who've given their lives to these sports outside of those sports. And so simply drawing a line, it doesn't seem to be as simple as just
I think if the line is drawn based on scientific studies, it's fine, and then take it across everywhere. I'm just saying, don't just play it with testosterone. Bring in arm length, bring in height, bring in weight. Have as many rules as you want to. It's going to make the sport more difficult to follow, but don't choose one aspect and then ignore all the others, because that's what brings disrepute and discrimination. And is it morally right? Is it ethically right? Are we discriminating against a certain group of people now? Because the DSD affects all populations. Why is the issue only coming up now? Okay, and so, yeah.
If I may add, please.
Yes, absolutely. I will come to you. But Ms. Zulu, because Mr. Botha and Mr. Chimane, I think everyone has drawn this distinction by you, Ms. Zulu. Why then do you think that even transgender women or people who identify as transgender, who may present as male and who may have identified as men the day before, why do you think it's fair for them to participate in female athletics?
For me, again, it goes back to the case of self-determination, but also the question of what the doctor has talked about. In cases of, if we are going to say someone with this level of testosterone must perform with men, then a certain person of a certain height must perform with people of the similar height. For me, I think the case of self-determination goes way back. It goes back to coloniality, it goes back to slavery and what's not. And so in these modern times, I think we must also be cognizant of letting people be what they say they are, because it's modern discriminatory. It's also dangerous for us to identify who people are or what they are, because should they fall in the cracks of what we don't think they are, we tend to harm them, or we tend to assault them in instances where we correct those assaults as being corrective and what's not. And so I think to combat all of that confusion, we must let people have the choice to say, this is where I will compete. And I do not think, unless if it's proven scientifically, that everyone that is a transgendered woman has an advantage over every cisgendered woman. As a person who also participates in sports, I do not think this is necessarily the case, because you find cisgendered women who run way faster than cisgendered men and otherwise. And so I think based on that, transgendered women must be given a fair opportunity to also participate in sports that are of their preference.
Absolutely. Mr. Botha, we're going to come to you after the break. I know that you're burning to intervene in the conversation, and we will certainly start with you. We're going to go to a break and come back with this fascinating conversation at the intersection of sports and politics. Welcome back to Unfiltered with me, Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and we're discussing the question of whether the definition of what it means to be a female athlete is a form of discrimination under the guise of science. Mr. Botha, as the coach of a DSD athlete who's just been affected by these regulations, you wanted to jump in on our debate and make a point about the way that the question of transgender and DSD is being unnecessarily conflated.
Yes, World Athletics announcement on transgenders being banned, as well as DSD, unless they lower their testosterone. I just want to inform the people that the reality is transgender people were never allowed to take part in World Athletics. The rules state clearly you must be born as a woman, and that is a biological woman. Obviously, now they are stating they are banned, but they have never been allowed to even take part. The transgender athletes that have taken part was in the American NCAA leagues and stuff that is not under World Athletics rulings. So these rules are only for World Athletics events. So athletes can run at other events, but obviously all of us know there's no money at the other events. So only the World Athletics events do have money.
But some Olympic events did allow transgender athletes. So outside of athletics, there are some sports that are beginning to allow transgender athletes.
Yes, but obviously Olympics has got a ruling that whatever sports code they're hosting, they will do the federation rules. So therefore, the athletic rules will take part within the Olympic Games then.
And it's interesting to see actually that these different bodies are coming to different determinations, which shows the confusion around this. We did actually reach out to World Athletics, and we did ask them to make a statement on this show, to defend their regulations. Of course, they said they were unable, but we do, just for the purposes of fairness and wanting to hear their side of the story, just want to show you on the screen now, some of the things that they have said about the fact that they want to preserve the integrity of these different sports. They want to have an equal, quote unquote, playing field. And unless they can create that equality in the integrity of the sport, then they believe that they will be letting down all the competitors of that sport. And I would encourage those of you who are interested in the question to look at their statement to ascertain whether you believe that they have a point or not. How do you respond to their statement, Mr. Chemane? Because they say, look, this is about fairness. We have to create fairness. How do you respond?
I feel like they are hiding behind English, because when you say you want to create a fair playing field for everyone, when you are being unfair in your decision, how then is it fair? You know what I mean? That's the starting point. Secondly, we're talking about athletes here. Coach can tell you how you prepare a short sprint runner and a middle distance runner and a long distance runner are three different things. Now, once you bring in these regulations that are going to steal your joy as an athlete, you are killing this athlete psychologically, you are killing this athlete emotionally, you are killing this athlete physically and otherwise. Now, what the mother body of athletics is saying here, for me, is just the opposite. When they were supposed to say, actually, we are being unfair, they say we are being fair. But you speak to athletes that are affected by these regulations, and you start seeing that actually here we're talking about damage of a hard-earned career of an athlete, because you prepare an athlete from zero to hero. You've got to go through a lot of time investing in preparing them for various athletics events. And when they are stars, boom, news changes. No. Sizwe cannot perform because of whatever reason. Caster cannot perform in the comfortable distance 800 meters because of superior testosterone. And you start realizing that this is actually bizarre, because if you are born naturally like that, how then is it an unfair playing field for you to partake with the rest of the females or with the rest of the males, if you are me?
Can I also ask you, in terms of broadcasting and being part of the world of actually bringing sport to people, it's funny to me that, you know, the athletics, World Athletics says, you know, this is about fairness, but this is becoming now part of the conversation about the sport. It's detracting from the actual competition that's actually supposed to be happening and people actually talking about it. How has this actually affected the broadcast of sport and the view of athletics, which seems to be mired in these ethical debates rather than people competing in athletic competitions?
Look, it's almost like we are living a lie. And I'll use three athletes. Caster Semenya, 800 meter specialist. There's Francine Niyonsaba from Burundi. A lot of times she would be the silver medalist. There's also Margaret Wambui from Kenya. She would grab a bronze stipendium, you know. Now, already you are killing the vibe of three African queens that goes out there to entertain the Africans, to represent the Africans well, and of course, to lift the African flag globally. And you bring in all these delusions of whatever you refer to as a fair playing field. And you can't go to a bumpy field and say, this is a perfect field because it's even, when you know very well at the back of your mind that there's no way that a bumpy field is even. So there's no way that an unfair decision is fair. So it brings a whole lot of pain, because now you've got an athlete that is sensational. You've got Christine Mboma, you've got Masilingi, Beatrice. These are young athletes that are still making their name on the charts of athletics in world athletics. And then there you come, backstep. It's almost like a backstep. I mean, to see news or hear news on social media this sensitive, it tells you a story that something could have been done correctly, but because this is an unfair ground or an unfair decision, there will always be dodginess in how even this news reach you as an athlete, as the main stakeholder of the game. You should be shown some better respect.
Ms. Zulu, at the end of the day here, there's also the question of gender discrimination, because quite frankly, Dr. Bana has already told us about the dramatic variations between people who identify as men and who are born as male. But we don't run around verifying their gender the same way we do when it comes to questions of women's bodies and those who are born as female. Is science just hiding behind gender discrimination and using scientific language to confuse us?
It definitely is, because as we're having this conversation, I keep on thinking about instances where cisgender male athletics have been questioned whether they are in fact male, or what level of estrogen do they have and what not have. And now it brings us back to the question of, it seems that this discrimination is specifically targeted at women. It targets people who identify as women in whatever form. Whether you're a cisgender woman or you're a transgender woman, the issue is specifically directed at women. And it also...
And black women.
And black women specifically. And it makes you wonder about the actual genders and races of people behind these laws. It's important to also investigate their own genders. Are these cisgender white European men making these rules? Are these cisgender European women making these rules? Because that question will then make us think of a more human rights approach in writing these rules, because it seems as though these rules are specifically targeted at women, and black women more specifically.
We'll be back after the break to summarize and bring the threads together on our conversation at the intersection of athletics and politics. See you for the final segment. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Dr. Bana, we're going to come to you after we take some social media questions, because I want to ask about a protest movement brewing in the medical space and what we do from here. But let's get some of your views from social media. Opinion says, it seems there is no African representative that participate during deliberations of this kind of rules, echoing Ms. Zulu's point. The question would be, as Africans, what are we planning in order to stop discrimination of this kind? Let's take Don Pablo, who says transgender women must run in their own category with other trans women, not to mix them in women's races. So on social media, people are starting to move towards what is to be done about this question. And the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture has issued a letter recently in response to these regulations, saying that some medical professionals in South Africa and abroad are actually going to resist the verification process of actually verifying DSD women, which they view as a violent act in and of itself. Would you support such a move? Do you think that is a way to advance this debate forward?
So I think for debate purposes, yes, definitely. In terms of if an athlete comes to me on her own volition to be tested, yeah, there should be no problem. If it's being done for them or for that person or for the media, that's a different story. And that's the same resistance doctors, not all, but a lot of doctors gave to the earlier decision that was made to say somebody who's got a high testosterone level and deems themselves to be female has to drop their testosterone level. There aren't going to be many doctors that are going to be willing to treat that person to that level. And so from that perspective, I think it's our way as a medical profession to voice our dissatisfaction towards this, but there aren't any easy answers. I just think there should be a lot more categories if we're going to start talking about just hormonal differences.
Mr. Botha, where to from here for you? What are the next steps that you are thinking of taking with Christine Mboma? What can coaches, athletes do to continue to take this debate forward?
So to be honest with you, we've been in consultation with a doctor in South Africa, and we are considering lowering testosterone. As the doctor said, the biggest challenge will be to keep it at a certain level, because having it on zero is going to be awful for any human being. But yes, I just want to come back with the fairness thing. You know, there's no fairness in life. If you look at the African child with no shoes and you look at the European child with 100 meters from wherever they stay, facilities and everything that's to their availability. If you look at money contracts, that's a lot better for men than women. If you look at contracts that for Africans is lower than for American athletes, there's no fairness. Then we need to get the whole thing square and everything must be fair then.
Thank you so much. And that's where we're going to have to leave it for our panel tonight. I want to thank all of you for joining us, for offering your insights from so many different perspectives. We learned a lot tonight. We learned, firstly, that questions of science can be just as political in the world of athletics as questions of politics can be in the world of sport. We learned the medical questions that are at play here, the human rights questions, the legal questions, what it's like to broadcast this, and what it's like to be a coach, what it's like to compete, and then have that competition that you've worked your whole life for taken away from you. I hope you found some value in this, and I look forward to joining you next week, Tuesday at 8 p.m. as we uncover truth and facts on Unfiltered. Have a good evening.